the moment money stops feeling scary. If you woke up tomorrow and money was no longer the first thing you worried about, how different would your life feel? Not rich, not fully financially free, just the absence of that tight feeling in your chest every time you open your banking app. No instinct to immediately close the screen because you are afraid of the numbers staring back at you. No mental math about whether buying a coffee today means cutting back for the rest of the week. There is a very small, very quiet moment, but if you have ever experienced it, you recognize it instantly. It is the moment you check your bank account and you smile. Not because the number is huge, but because for the first time in a long time, money no longer scares you. What is interesting is that this moment does not arrive when you have $1 million. It does not arrive when you earn 6 figures, despite what many people believe. In reality, plenty of high earners live with constant financial stress. As income rises, pressure rises with it. The anxiety does not disappear, it simply changes form. There is another number, much more modest, much less talked about. But once you reach it, your relationship with money begins to change in a way that is very hard to reverse. That number is $20,000. It does not sound impressive. It is not enough to retire, not enough to brag about, not enough to change your social status, and that is exactly why most people underestimate its power. $20,000 does not make you rich. It makes you stop living in a constant state of financial fear. Most people assume that building wealth is slow, steady, and linear. You earn a bit more, save a bit more, invest a bit more, and hope that over time, everything works out. But real financial progress does not move in a straight line. It moves through invisible thresholds. No one teaches you about these thresholds. They are not in textbooks. They do not show up on your paycheck. But once you cross them, the rules of the game change completely. $20,000 is the first and most important one. Before this point, almost every financial decision is driven by fear. Fear of not having enough, fear of an unexpected expense, fear of losing your job, fear of making the wrong move. Money stops being a tool and becomes background pressure, constantly present in your mind even when you are not actively thinking about it. After this threshold, something strange happens. Not because you suddenly have more money to spend, but because your brain exits survival mode. Psychologists call it survival mode for a reason. When you do not have savings, your brain is forced to focus almost entirely on avoiding immediate danger. How do I make it to the next paycheck? How do I avoid mistakes? How do I minimize risk at all costs? In that state, long-term thinking is impossible. You cannot see opportunities. You cannot plan for growth. It is like trying to plan your future while your house is on fire. $20,000 is the moment that fire is put out. Not because every problem disappears, but because you finally create enough breathing room for your brain. And when your brain can breathe, the way you think about money, work, risk, and opportunity begins to change. If you've ever wondered why some people start with nothing but seem to gain momentum over time, this is the missing piece. And if this kind of perspective helps you see money more clearly, stay with this video until the end. Not because it promises anything dramatic, but because it helps you understand where you actually are on your financial journey. In the next part, we will go deeper into why $20,000 is not just a number, but a psychological turning point that separates living paycheck to paycheck from truly beginning to build wealth. The invisible threshold most people never notice. Before we go any further, pause for a moment and think about how you used to imagine wealth being built. When most people think about money, two familiar images come to mind. The first is someone born with an advantage, a wealthy family, a trust fund, a life where bills and rent were never a real concern. The second is someone who grinds for decades, saving little by little, accumulating slowly, hoping that one day things will finally feel easier. Both of those images are missing a crucial piece. The truth is that financial progress is not determined by income, hard work, or luck alone. It depends heavily on whether you are standing before or after certain invisible financial thresholds. These thresholds are not taught in school. No one explains them to you growing up. And because they are invisible, most people move through their entire lives without understanding why they always feel stuck, even when they are doing everything right. $20,000 is the first of those thresholds. Imagine trying to push a massive boulder up a steep hill. At the beginning, the boulder feels impossibly heavy. Every step forward requires maximum effort. You slip, you get tired, you start doubting yourself. There are moments when you wonder whether this is even worth it or if giving up would hurt less. That is exactly what the early stages of saving and investing feel like for most people. Every $100 saved comes at the cost of saying no to very real and very immediate pleasures. Eating out, taking a trip, treating yourself after a stressful week. Progress feels painfully slow. You save a few thousand, then something happens and you have to pull money back out. Your car breaks down, a medical bill shows up, rent goes up. Every time it feels like you are gaining momentum, the boulder slips backward, dragging that familiar sense of failure with it. But there is a moment that very few people talk about when the boulder starts to change. Once you build enough momentum, enough forward force, you get close to the top of the hill, and the instant you crest it, gravity flips. What used to work against you begins to work in your favor. The boulder no longer requires all of your strength. It starts to roll on its own. $20,000 is that hilltop. Everything before this number feels like pushing uphill against gravity. You do a lot of work and see very little reward. Everything after this point feels different, not because you stop putting in effort, but because your effort finally gets amplified. What makes this milestone especially interesting is that the difference is not just mathematical. It is not simply that you have more money to invest or that your returns look bigger in dollar terms. The biggest change happens in your mind. When you do not have savings, your brain is locked into short-term questions. How do I survive until the end of the month? How do I avoid mistakes? How do I minimize risk at all costs? In that state, you tend to accept any job, even a terrible one, because you do not have alternatives. You stay in toxic environments because leaving feels too dangerous. You say yes to things you do not want to do because you need the money. This is not about weak willpower or a lack of ambition. It is a biological limit of the human brain. When we feel threatened, long-term thinking shuts down. But once you cross the $20,000 threshold, something very different happens. Your brain starts asking new questions. Not just how to survive, but how to grow. Not just how to react to problems, but how to build proactively. You begin to see the bigger picture. You finally have the mental space to think in terms of strategy instead of constant damage control. And this is not just a vague feeling. Research from Vanguard shows that having just $2,000 in emergency savings can increase financial well-being by more than 20%. $2,000, an amount many people are willing to spend on a vacation or a new laptop without hesitation. When that emergency fund grows to 3 to 6 months of living expenses, which for most people lands around $20,000, financial well-being improves even further. But more importantly, you create enough breathing room to start thinking about building wealth instead of merely protecting what little you have. In the next part, we will look at why the math of money starts to change immediately after you reach $20,000, and why the same effort, using the same strategy, suddenly begins to produce dramatically faster results when the math finally starts working in your favor. After crossing the $20,000 threshold, many people describe the same feeling, even if they have never sat down to analyze it with numbers. They say things start to feel lighter, not because life suddenly becomes easy, but because their effort finally begins to create real momentum. This is where math starts doing what it has always done, but until now you were simply too small to feel it. Imagine saving and investing $1,000 every month. It is not an extreme amount, but it requires discipline. If you keep that pace and earn an average return of around 8% per year, reaching your first $20,000 takes roughly 19 months. Nearly 2 years of consistency, sacrifice, and delayed gratification. Those 2 years are not comfortable. For most of that time, progress feels slow. Your balance grows inch by inch, and your investment returns look almost insignificant. You are doing many things right, but the reward feels so small that it is easy to wonder whether you are wasting your time. This is the stage where most people quit. But if you push through and reach that first $20,000, something interesting happens. Your second $20,000 does not take another 19 months. It takes closer to 17. You are not working harder. You are not saving more each month. You are not using a different investment strategy. The only difference is that now you have $20,000 working alongside you. Your money starts doing part of the work. This is the moment when compound interest stops being a textbook concept and becomes a personal experience. You look back and realize that with the same effort and the same discipline, the time required to reach the same milestone has shortened. As you move toward your third $20,000, the timeline shrinks even further. Your personal contributions make up a smaller share of total growth while your money contributes more and more. Discipline still matters, but you are no longer carrying all the weight alone. And when you zoom out further, the numbers begin to feel almost absurd. Once your investment portfolio reaches around $400,000, your next 20,000 can be generated in as little as 5 months. The same amount that once took nearly 2 years of effort now appears almost automatically. This does not happen because you suddenly become smarter or gain access to secret investment opportunities. It happens because math finally has enough scale to show its power. Many people assume that wealthy individuals have access to investments that ordinary people cannot touch. Exclusive hedge funds, insider deals, financial secrets passed around among elites. At the very highest levels, some of that is true, but it has nothing to do with what is happening at the $20,000 stage. The real explanation is much simpler and far more encouraging. The same return, the same risk, and the same assets produce completely different outcomes at different scales. When you invest $1,000 and earn 10%, you make $100. That feels nice, but it does not change your life. Apply that same 10% to $10,000, and now you are looking at $1,000 in gains. Suddenly it matters. At $20,000, an 8% return equals roughly $1,600 per year. Money that shows up without extra work hours, without additional stress, without sacrificing more of your time, money you did not have to earn directly through your job. The investment strategy itself is no more sophisticated than what someone with $1,000 can use. The same index funds, the same platforms, the same basic principles. The only difference is scale, and that scale turns small percentages into real financial progress. But this is the part most people miss, and it may be the most important point in this entire story. When you save $20,000, you are not just accumulating money, you are building something far more valuable. You are changing who you are. In the next part, we will explore how the process of reaching $20,000 rewires your habits and your financial identity, and why that matters even more than any investment strategy when you become someone who controls money. On the surface, $20,000 looks like just a number in a bank account. But what truly changes at this milestone is not what appears on your statement. It is how you behave around money, and more importantly, how you see yourself. Think carefully about what it actually takes to go from $0 to $20,000. Unless you earn an unusually high income or live with almost no expenses, this journey does not happen by accident. It requires sustained discipline over many months, sometimes years. It forces you to confront uncomfortable choices that most people avoid. You have to know exactly where your money is going. You have to look directly at spending you once ignored. You have to say no to things you want right now in exchange for things you want more in the future. And you have to do this not once, but repeatedly until it becomes a habit. By the time you reach $20,000, you have proven something critical to yourself. You are no longer someone who reacts to money. You are someone who can make decisions, delay gratification, and stick to a plan even when no one is watching. That is not just a financial skill. It is a life skill. This shift in identity has far wider effects than most people realize. Before this point, a small purchase like a $4 coffee might trigger mental calculations and even guilt. You were not just asking whether you could afford it. You were asking whether you were being irresponsible. After reaching $20,000, those questions fade away. Not because you become careless, but because you have proven your ability to prioritize. You can make the right big decisions, so the small ones no longer drain your mental energy. But there is another psychological shift at this level that is talked about even less, and it may be even more important. You begin to see opportunities instead of just threats. When you live paycheck to paycheck, every unexpected event feels like a disaster. A car repair is not an inconvenience, it is a crisis. A broken laptop is not annoying, it is a direct hit to your budget. A rent increase is not something to negotiate. It is a threat to your stability. In that state, there is no space to think in terms of possibility. Everything is filtered through risk and loss. When you have $20,000, the same events happen, but your response is completely different. Car repairs are annoying, but they do not derail your month. A broken laptop becomes an opportunity to upgrade. A rent increase is unpleasant, but it may be a signal to look for a better option or negotiate higher pay. And then you start noticing opportunities you never would have considered before. A friend mentioned starting a business and looking for investors. Before, you would listen politely and move on. Now, you can actually sit down and evaluate whether putting $5,000 into it makes sense. A fixer-upper property appears at an attractive price. Before, you would scroll past it and feel a twinge of envy. Now, you can run the numbers. Money does not automatically create opportunities, but it gives you the right to consider them. This is where a familiar phrase begins to make practical sense. Money goes to money. not because the universe favors the wealthy, but because having money gives you options, and options create more ways to make money. This shift also leads to a very counterintuitive change in how you think about spending. In the next part, I will explain why reaching $20,000 makes you care less about small expenses and far more about big decisions, and why this change frees up an enormous amount of mental energy when small expenses stop mattering. There is an interesting paradox that appears once you build a solid financial foundation. You start caring less about every small dollar while becoming far more serious about big decisions. From the outside, this can look like carelessness. In reality, it is a sign of financial maturity. When you do not have savings, every expense carries psychological weight. You stand in the grocery aisle debating brand name versus generic cereal. You hesitate between buying coffee or making it at home. You wonder whether regular gas or premium is the smarter choice. These small decisions consume mental energy, not because they matter so much, but because every dollar feels like a survival issue. But when you have $20,000, something becomes very clear. These micro decisions no longer have the power to determine your financial future. Even if you overspend on coffee every day, the difference between buying it and skipping it might be a few $100 to $1,000 per year. That is not nothing, but it is not enough to break a well-structured financial plan. What actually matters are the macro decisions: where you live, what you drive, how much you save, where you invest. These choices can swing your net worth by tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars over time. Once you reach $20,000, you start allocating your attention where it has the most leverage. Instead of spending hours optimizing tiny expenses, you focus on optimizing the factors that truly move the needle. You think more carefully about housing costs. You become serious about increasing income. You make sure your investment strategy aligns with your long-term goals. This shift creates a sense of mental freedom that is hard to describe. You are no longer forced to make hundreds of small, stressful decisions every day. Your financial life becomes simpler, and when your mind is no longer occupied by trivial details, you finally have the space to think strategically. That is where real progress begins. And this change does not stop with spending. It spills into another area that deeply affects both your income and your quality of life: your work. In the next part, I will explain why $20,000 completely changes your position in your career, and how having this financial buffer means you are no longer the weaker party in every negotiation. When your job stops holding you hostage. There is an uncomfortable truth that very few people say out loud. When you are living entirely off your next paycheck, your job is not just where you earn money, it controls you. You may not notice it when things are relatively stable, but look closer. Without a financial buffer, you are in an extremely weak position. Your boss may be difficult, your work environment may be toxic, your workload may be unreasonable, yet you stay, not because you want to, but because you have to. You do not ask for a raise because there is always a quiet fear that one wrong move could cost you your only source of income. You do not push back against unreasonable demands because stability feels more important than fairness. You do not explore better opportunities because taking time off to interview feels like too big of a gamble. In that situation, no one needs to say it out loud. Everyone can feel it. You need the job more than it needs you. $20,000 changes that entire power dynamic. When you have enough money to live for several months without income, you gain something very few people truly have: the ability to walk away. Not to act recklessly or burn bridges, but to know that you have a choice. The mere existence of that choice creates a profound psychological shift. You no longer walk into work afraid. You show up with quiet confidence. You know that if things become unacceptable, you can say no. What is interesting is that in most cases, you never even have to use this option. Just knowing you can walk away changes how you behave. You become more direct. You are willing to take on harder projects because you are no longer afraid of failure. You speak up with ideas and take responsibility for them. And when you show up that way, people notice. You are trusted with more important work. You are seen as capable and grounded, and that often leads to the very thing you were once afraid to ask for: higher income. This creates a positive feedback loop that very few people ever enter. Financial buffer creates confidence. Confidence leads to opportunity and higher pay. Higher pay accelerates savings and creates even more options. But right here is where many people make the biggest mistake of their financial journey. In the next part, I will explain the most dangerous trap that appears right after you reach $20,000. A trap that sends many people straight back to where they started, simply because they misunderstand what this milestone really means. The trap that makes people think they have arrived. The moment you reach $20,000 often comes with a very understandable emotional response: relief, pride, and a quiet thought that maybe you can finally relax a little. After months or years of discipline, sacrifice, and saying no to yourself, it feels like you deserve a reward. That thought is the trap. Many people feel the positive psychological shift that $20,000 brings and immediately turn it into a reason to undo the foundation they just built. They buy a new car because they believe they are now stable enough to handle the payment. They book an expensive vacation to reward themselves, or they use the money as a down payment on a home they cannot truly afford. These decisions are usually justified with the same sentence: I worked hard, I deserve this. The problem is not enjoying your progress. The problem is that $20,000 was never meant to be a reward. It is a foundation. It is a seed. And if you dig up the seed to eat it, you cannot expect a tree to grow later. $20,000 creates psychological change, choice, and momentum, but only if it stays where it belongs. When you spend it on things that do not create long-term value, you lose more than money. You lose the most powerful advantage you just earned. This becomes especially clear when you look at the large expenses society has normalized, particularly cars. On average, people spend $600 to $800 per month on transportation when you add up payments, insurance, maintenance, and fuel. Over 40 years, that easily exceeds $400,000. $400,000 just to move from point A to point B. Meanwhile, many people claim they cannot afford to save for retirement. They say investing is a luxury. They say the future is uncertain. The irony is that the moment you drive a new car off the lot, it loses roughly 20% of its value. You are not just spending money, you are converting it into an asset that rapidly loses value. Compare that with investing the same amount into a diversified portfolio. One path evaporates value, the other compounds it over time. Two completely different outcomes starting from the same decision. When you have $20,000, the way you view big purchases begins to change. You stop asking whether you can afford the monthly payment. You start asking a more important question: what is this really costing me in the future? A $30,000 car is not just $30,000. It is money that could become more than $200,000 over 20 years of reasonable investing. Once you see that clearly, driving a reliable used car no longer feels like a sacrifice. It feels like a strategic choice. And here is the quiet irony. The person driving the flashy new car is often under more financial pressure than the person driving the older one. One looks successful, the other is quietly building freedom. In the next part, we will extend this way of thinking to every major financial decision in life: housing, education, travel, and hobbies. And we will explore why, once you truly understand opportunity cost, many things that once felt irresistible suddenly lose their appeal. When every decision passes through the lens of opportunity, once you cross the $20,000 mark and avoid the trap of spending it as a reward, a deeper shift begins to take place. You no longer see money simply as something to spend or stockpile. You start seeing it as a tool for allocating opportunity. Every major financial decision now carries a new question, a quiet one, but a sharp one. If I use my money this way, what am I giving up in the future? That question does not make life dull or joyless. In fact, it does the opposite. It makes your choices more intentional. You begin to realize that many of the things you once thought you wanted were really just social reflexes. A bigger apartment because everyone around you is upgrading, an expensive vacation because social media presents it as the standard, a costly hobby because it signals success. When you run those desires through the lens of opportunity, their pull changes. They do not disappear entirely, but they stop winning automatically. A larger apartment may feel more comfortable, but if it delays financial independence by 5 years, you start questioning whether the trade-off is worth it. A luxury vacation can be an amazing experience, but if it consumes money that could generate income for years, you become more selective about frequency and scale. What surprises many people is that once they start thinking this way, they often realize they do not actually want as much as they thought. Not because they become cheap, but because they gain clarity about what truly adds long-term value to their lives. That clarity creates a new kind of freedom. You are no longer pulled around by unspoken expectations. You stop chasing other people's definitions of success. You spend less on things that do not matter and feel comfortable spending more on things that genuinely align with your goals. And this is where many people notice something unexpected. When you control your money, money starts serving your life instead of the other way around. $20,000 is not the destination. It is the beginning of a new way of thinking. A way of thinking where every decision is placed in a long-term context, where every choice becomes a small step toward the life you actually want to design. In the next part, I will bring all of these ideas together and explain why $20,000 does not make you wealthy, but clearly marks the line between merely surviving and intentionally shaping your future, the line between surviving and designing your life. At this point, the picture should be much clearer. $20,000 is not a flashy number. It does not change your social status. It does not make people look at you differently, but it quietly changes how you interact with the world. Before reaching this point, most of your actions are reactive. You react to bills, you react to demands at work, you react to unexpected events in life. Everything feels defensive. You are not really choosing. You are trying to avoid mistakes. After crossing the $20,000 mark, you begin to enter a different state. You stop reacting and start designing. Designing does not mean everything is under your control. Life is still uncertain. But you are no longer completely at its mercy. You have enough buffer to adjust your direction. You have enough space to think before you act. This shift shows up most clearly in the questions you ask yourself. Instead of asking how to get through this month, you ask what you are building over the next 5 years. Instead of asking whether you can afford a decision, you ask whether that decision moves you closer to or farther from the life you want. Those questions lead to different choices. You invest more consistently. You are less shaken by short-term market noise. You do not panic when negative headlines appear. You understand that you are playing a long game and that $20,000 is the entry ticket that allows you to play it seriously. Many people never reach this state, not because they lack ability, but because they never build a foundation strong enough to escape survival mode. They may earn more money over time, but their mindset remains trapped in day-to-day stress. $20,000 breaks that loop. It does not offer total certainty, but it gives you something more valuable, the ability to think long-term. And once you have that ability, every decision that follows has a better chance of leading to growth instead of simply maintaining the status quo. In the final part, I will close this story by tying everything together and explaining why starting to build this foundation today is one of the most important decisions you can make for your future self. The quiet foundation of a self-directed life. $20,000 will not make you wake up one morning feeling rich. It will not transform your life in a dramatic way that others can immediately see. There is no big moment, no applause, no outside validation. But it does something far more important. It changes your trajectory. Before this point, your financial life is like a small boat in fast-moving water. You are constantly adjusting just to stay afloat. All of your energy goes into not capsizing. There is no time or space to think about direction because the only priority is survival. After this point, the boat is still small, but the water is calmer. You are no longer fighting just to stay above the surface. You can lift your head, look farther ahead, and begin steering intentionally. That is the difference between existing and actively living. $20,000 is not a magic number. It does not replace discipline. It does not eliminate risk. It does not guarantee success. But it creates a psychological foundation strong enough for everything else to be built in a healthy way. It gives you time. It gives you options. It gives you the ability to say no when necessary and yes when real opportunities appear. It gives you permission to think long-term in a world that constantly pushes people to react short-term. And perhaps most importantly, it gives you trust in yourself. Trust that you can set a difficult goal, pursue it quietly, and achieve it through consistency. Once you've done that with $20,000, you have proven that you can do it with any financial goal that follows. This is why $20,000 is not the destination. It is the starting point, the point where money begins to serve your life instead of controlling it. The point where you stop reacting to circumstances and start designing your own path. If you are still before this milestone, understand that the difficulty you feel right now is not a sign of failure. It is a natural part of pushing the boulder uphill. And if you stay consistent long enough, there will be a moment when gravity changes direction. If you have already crossed this milestone, protect it. Do not treat it like a reward. Treat it like the foundation of your future freedom. Because the version of you 5, 10, or 20 years from now is not shaped by flashy moments, but by the quiet decisions you make starting today. If there is one thing to take away from this story, it is not the number $20,000. It is the understanding that the biggest changes in life often begin quietly, without noise, without attention, but powerful enough to alter your entire direction over time. On Money Signals, we do not talk about getting rich fast. We talk about the small signals that show you are moving in the right direction even when no one else notices yet. If you want to keep seeing money more clearly, more calmly, and more long-term, Stay with the channel, not to chase numbers, but to understand where you stand and how to move forward intentionally. And as always, take a moment to think about your most recent financial decision, not whether it was big or small, but whether it is pulling you forward or keeping you in the same place. We will continue in the next video.